My name's Jody Seasonwine. I'm the Senior Curator of Western Art here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. And today is our final program of the year in our Hidden Histories of Art series. This is a series that delves into the sometimes surprising contexts of works of art that are on view in the galleries. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Lynn Stephen today, who's going to be talking about the history of chocolate in the Americas. Inspired by, the reason I asked her to give this talk is because we have a silver chocolate pot that's on view in our silver display upstairs in our European gallery, and I would invite you to go upstairs and take a look at it after the lecture. Dr. Stephen is Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies, known here on campus as CLAS, because we love our acronyms, at the University of Oregon. Her scholarly work has centered the impact of globalization, migration, nationalism, and the politics of culture on indigenous communities in the Americas. Her most recent book is titled We Are the Face of Oaxaca, Testimony and Social Movements, which was published in 2013 by Duke University Press. Current projects include a book on renowned Mexican author Elena Poniatowska and a comparative research project on gender and Mexican and Central American refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers in the U.S. This spring, she taught an undergraduate lecture class on the anthropology of chocolate, the research for which informs her lecture today on the history of chocolate in the Americas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynn Stephen.
I did not bring chocolate, so I'm sorry. One of the highlights of the class was one of the owners of Euphoria Chocolate came to the class and gave a lecture and handed out two different kinds of samples, like their commercial grade chocolate buttons and then what he calls bean to bar truffles. So that was, so if you want to sign up for my class, comes with chocolate. Yeah. But I'm sorry not to have chocolate here. But thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk again about chocolate. Having done 10 weeks on chocolate, I'm ready to go. So this is actually, I thought I would start with the chocolate pot. This is the chocolate pot that is on display upstairs, which is part of the sort of California arts and crafts movement. It was made by Clement Spiegel, a prominent silversmith, and that's sort of the object that this talk is sort of tied to. And it's modeled after, the next one I'm going to show you is a European chocolate pot, probably inspired by the court of Louis XIV. But in fact, this chocolate pot and the substance within it, chocolate, has its history is here in our continent. And the reason we drink it today has to do with this long history, which I'm not going to cover all of. This is just so you can compare the two objects. This is a French chocolate pot from 1765. It's basically the same as the one that you observed, except it's sitting on these sort of three legs. It has a handle, it has a spout, and at the top there's an opening for the molinillo, which is a sort of beater for the chocolate. And when I talked to you about how cacao was used and processed by indigenous peoples, how foam is created, and then how that technology was transferred to Europe, then you'll have a better understanding of that beater. In fact, until about 1860 in Europe, the technology for producing chocolate was the same as indigenous peoples, say, 1,000 years ago, which involved grinding it on a metate, producing the foam in different ways. So the technology really didn't change in terms of how chocolate, even cocoa powder that we put in hot chocolate, or the invention of the chocolate bar in the form that we know it is a very recent creation. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk us through the history of chocolate in the Americas, particularly from an indigenous perspective, how it got to Europe, where it was, And then I'm going to take us back. I'm going to end up with some video I shot last summer in preparation for my class to show you kind of the steps of sort of buying cacao and preparing chocolate in a Zapotec community, Teotitlán del Valle, where I've been doing field work for 30 years. And last summer I filmed with my son Jose. We filmed a whole day of making chocolate. So this is, you can see another chocolate pot from, this is a painting from 1744, but chocolate actually went to Europe from Mesoamerica, probably most likely entering first through Spain, Portugal, and Italy, then making its way into France and England, and then sort of back to North America in New England, from England to New England on that end. California, as you might know, was a part of New Spain and Mexico until 1848. I always like to remind people in Oregon that we live on the Mexican border, because until really pretty recently, historically, that is how it's been. And there's plenty of evidence that cacao was processed by indigenous peoples in New Mexico and further up into that other part of Mexico. So the processing of cacao into chocolate began in Mesoamerica. And this is just, again, a reminder of, this is Cortez, and I'll come back to him, who was the conquistador involved in the colonization of Mexico, but his explorations took him, fairly close to what we now consider to be the U.S. So cacao itself, the plant, likely originated in the wild in the Amazonian basin, and people ate the fruit of the cacao. It's a very sort of pulpy, rich fruit, probably for a long time before the seeds were dried, toasted, and ground into chocolate. That's a later process. So the cacao tree has a fruit, and the beans come from the seeds inside the pod.
That's the fruit?
That is the fruit, yes. Actually, I have a colleague who offered to loan me a cacao pod, and I forgot to bring it. Yes. It's sweet and pulpy. I don't think it's really comparable to any other fruit. And it only grows at sort of a certain, around the equator and in a very specific sort of latitude. But most cacao today, in fact, the majority of cacao that's used in all kinds of chocolate today is grown in West Africa. It's grown in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. It's grown in Ecuador, Brazil. Those are the four big producers, and then small amounts other places. But for a very long time, the source was Mesoamerica. So I'm going to talk just a little bit first about the kind of different kinds. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to give you some different kinds of anthropological evidence about the presence of cacao, particularly in Mayan cultures. And that is where we see a lot of information about cacao from archaeology, linguistically, and even in terms of chemical analysis of some of the chemical components. So one of the things that we look at in linguistics is what we call proto-languages, or how one language evolves from the other. And you can look at how a concept or a word sort of travels through time to trace that. So one of the things we can see, for example, in Mayan languages, is the presence of cacao, or the base word that we understand as cacao in Spanish, in a variety of Mayan languages. These are words in Yucatec Maya, which is spoken still by about 1 million people. A lot of them live in San Francisco. And you can find all kinds of roots that make reference to the elements of the word cacao. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you the Mayan glyph. There's two kinds of ways that Mayan writing works. One is as a symbol, and the other is by sort of sounds or syllabic signs that are put together. So there's a syllabic sign for cacao that I'll show you. But there are many, just this whole set of terms that relate to cacao, to chocolate, to foam, to many different things. So one of the pieces of evidence that we have is from cacao vessels that were used, ceramic vessels that were used primarily by elites. One of the things about the history of chocolate, both in Mesoamerica and in Europe, was that it was a drink that was reserved for elites. And in Mayan society and Mexica or Aztec society, it was a very ranked society that had, royalty of different kinds, and commoners and serfs and slaves. And it was only the folks at the top who got the chocolate, along with traders. So this is a scene from a drinking cup, and it is Yuki Bakiwan Tuk Bakar, the drinking cup of Bahe Khan Tuk, who is the ruler. So this is his chocolate vessel. There's a whole series of these vessels. Some archaeologists refer to them as vases that sort of register the name of someone, what the vessel is for, and that it's for drinking cacao. This is a scene from a mural, but it shows the way that foam, was raised among Mayan royalty in cacao, and that is by pouring it from one vessel into another one and then repeating that. That's how the foam was created without a beater. And the foam itself is very, very important culturally. So there's a whole set of these vases, as I mentioned, and they offer us a lot of information. They tell us things in writing. They tell us things about Mayan society. And then they also tell us, for example, this is a basket of cacao sort of seated underneath the ruler. So cacao had many, many uses and meanings. And we also find sort of chemical, what we might call chemical footprints of theobromine and caffeine, which are two of the primary elements in cacao. Okay, and that's what gives it that sort of kick, whether you eat a chocolate bar or in southern Mexico, in most communities, people do not start the day with a cup of coffee. They start the day with a cup of chocolate. And it really provides that same, as a dedicated coffee drinker, coffee addict, I guess I could honestly say, I am able to very successfully go and start my day with a cup or two of hot chocolate, and it has the same good effect for me of making me feel awake. So archaeologists can do analysis. This is actually a cacao vessel with a top. And this is the glyph for cacao, the Mayan glyph for cacao. So we know that this vessel, I mean, there's many different ways that it's telling us that it was made for chocolate. The form of the vessel, the chemical analysis where we find, these main ingredients, and then it's also nicely labeled with the glyph that tells us that it was used for cacao. This is the glyph. It kind of has two elements. This thing that looks kind of like a fish is pronounced ka, and it's doubled cacao. Wa is this kind of tail on the end, and that's a symbol that's putting two symbols together. That's another prop to go through sort of the Mayan writing system. We also have a lot of evidence, for example, in codices. These are documents, some of which were written before the conquest, that depict history and stories and all kinds of things. Many of them make reference to cacao. For example, this is the Codex Borgia that shows a ritual drinking of cacao in that bowl there. Is that a knife with blood on it? down here, it's some kind of knife. I don't know if that's blood or not. I am not an expert in reading all elements of all codices.
So would that be Mayan or?
No, this is a Mexica Codex. It's an Aztec Codex. How many of you have heard of the Popol Vuh? Okay, very important sort of Mayan sacred book that talks about the story of how Mayan people were created. And an important part of that story involves, there's sort of several false attempts to create humans out of wood and out of other materials, out of mud. And it starts in the underworld, and at one point there's a princess who actually comes, there's a there's a tree that she climbs up, that in the pods are actually the heads of two men who have died. And she touches one of them, sort of gets impregnated by this tree, and climbs up the tree into the surface of the world that we see, and begins the story of life. So cacao trees in a number of indigenous cultures, along with cedar trees, are kind of centrally located in terms of the four cardinal directions by connecting the underworld with the plane we live on, and really in the creation of life. So you can see the tree right here. So it's a very sacred symbol. And for example, there's evidence now, I'm going to show you the zones where cacao grew. It was very extensive, but the Maya of the Yucatan, for example, I don't know if anyone has ever been to a cenote, to kind of a sacred well. They're these sort of microclimates, and they're finding now a lot of remains of cacao trees planted there. This is the landscape is sort of limestone, but then there's these kind of sinkholes and wells that have this microclimate, and there's cacao trees planted around that, used by elites. So this is just sort of a landscape picture, but there's a long association among Mesoamerican indigenous people of connecting cacao to the creation of humans, an association of cacao and chocolate with blood, both the blood of giving life, the blood of war, the blood of death, and sort of continuity, that is kind of part of this story of human continuity. There's also evidence of the use of cacao in rituals. I mentioned the Popol Vuh. There's a number of very Fray de Nalanda was a bishop in the Yucatan who burned most of the Mayan sacred books. The Popol Vuh is one that got away. But he wrote a lot about Mayan people. He actually wrote a version of the Mayan phonetic alphabet. He figured out some significant portions of it. And he wrote, he was dedicated to trying to get rid of indigenous religion and custom. So he wrote, for example, he observed that cacao was very important in naming ceremonies for Mayan babies. He wrote about what he called the baptism of a child with what he called virgin water that comes out of these cenotes and cacao and flowers. So we see even among the early chroniclers evidence of sort of the sacred use of cacao and its connection to sort of very important life cycle events. There are a number of places in other codices where we see cacao being used to sort of consecrate marriage as sort of the exchange of cacao, drinking cacao. You can go online and you can book yourself a Mayan New Age wedding, even today, where they will give you cacao to drink. There's a number of rites of passage, and often one of the interesting parts of what I taught in my class was about grave sites that have been found up to 1,500 years ago. For example, of a shaman with cacao sort of accompanying the shaman. And the idea is that the cacao sort of goes with people, both to sort of offer to people as needed on the way, the journey through the underworld and into the next world, and also just to sort of provide nourishment to the people. There are contemporary also rituals of marriage and death that can involve cacao. So it has, I'm just trying to give you sort of the symbolic weight of cacao. This is another sort of codex, the Madrid Codex, that depicts the wedding of the god Chak and Ishikab getting married, and again, they are giving their cacao. This is from another codex. This is a Mexica image, post-conquest codex that shows this is a bundle, this is a body that's being prepared, it's being wrapped, it's actually wrapped and also with a petate, with a sort of woven palm mat. And this is a basket of cacao that is, again, going to accompany the dead. Now, cacao also was very important economically. It was a system of exchange, and it was paid in tribute to, for example, Moctezuma and to Mexica royalty. This was sort of registered in some of the codices. A lot of the cacao, and in fact the Mexica, went down and actually conquered a region known now today as Soconusco, which is sort of borders Chiapas, Mexico, and Oaxaca. And it's a very rich cacao producing region. It's not producing very much cacao, but the Mexica actually went down there deliberately to conquer that so that they could get the cacao shipped back up. There are records that indicate an actual value for cacao beans. A ripe avocado is worth 2 cacao beans. A green one is worth 3. A chicken is 7. So there's a whole sort of market in cacao beans, and archaeologists have even found fake cacao beans, right? Because it was valuable, so people were producing, like counterfeit funds. So it also served as a medium of exchange. This is just a picture of the Tlatelolco market, which was one of the main markets of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. This is from a Diego Rivera mural, where cacao was used in that market to purchase things. This is, the next few slides, are of tribute payments that came to Tenochtitlan from these sort of outlying regions, from Oaxaca, from Chiapas, from the Soconusco, other areas. And right here, between the jaguar skins, this is a bundle of cacao. It says even in Spanish, carga cacao. And there were traders called Pochtecas who, carried by hand, they would carry these cargoes of cacao, many, many, many miles from way southern, what we now call way southern Mexico, back to Mexico City. This is another page from the same codex, the Codex Mendoza, showing baskets of ground cacao, in other words, prepared, up here on the top. So cacao was making its way, and it was primarily consumed by elites, as I mentioned, as chocolate, as hot chocolate. Mexica warriors were also provisioned with blocks of cacao to make chocolate with, which is interesting because the last class I did, the second to last class, was how Hershey's got a major start in the global market because during World War II, Hershey's was contracted by the US government to produce the Ration D bar, which was Hershey's chocolate. And if you get, yesterday I had 2 MREs in my class, meal ready to eat, from the US military. Chocolate is still there. So chocolate has been associated with sort of military provisioning for a long time. These next two maps sort of show you the route, the very complex cacao trading routes that went all the way down into the Gulf of Honduras. There were routes that went through the Yucatan Peninsula, a lot of trade that went by canoes, and then sort of coming up through Oaxaca. And these were very, very elaborate trade routes that provisioned not only the Mexica, but Mayan kingdoms and other places. These are some of the major cacao-producing regions. Here's the Soconusco that I was talking about, kind of right on the border of what we call Guatemala. The Quiche Maya kingdom also pulled from Suchitepeques and these other areas, other cacao-producing regions. So that's kind of where cacao, right before the conquest, was being grown.
So when?
Yes.
So it's mostly near the coast?
Yeah, it's coastal, it's lowland, it is a different kind of climate than, for example, coffee. Coffee needs to be grown up high to have more altitude, and cacao really needs very mild, coastal, kind of climate, and that's still where most of it is grown. Okay, so I wanted to just tell, I decided to do this through sort of sharing recipes, but I needed to, about how cacao got to Europe. So this is Tenochtitlan, major city, perhaps the largest city in the world, in 1519, when Cortez arrives. And Cortez discovers chocolate in the markets. The other place where cacao sort of had contact with explorers was a little bit earlier with Columbus on his fourth voyage. He actually sailed many places, but sort of was sailing in the Bay of Honduras and off the Bay of Honduras. And ran into his son, actually, Fernando Colon, wrote this very interesting passage in his diary, right? They ran into these boats. This is taken from a mural in Bonampak. But he talked about these canoes as being the costliest and handsomest, with cotton mantles and what people were wearing, and they had even shade on them. And then he says, many of the almonds, right? So he thought these were almonds because, of course, there is no cacao in Spain. There are almonds, which the Indians of New Spain use in currency. And these the Indians in the canoe valued greatly, for I noticed when they were brought aboard with other goods and some fell to the floor, all the Indians stooped to pick them up as if they had lost something of great value. And one of the things that happened in the conquest of Tenochtitlan was they raided Moctezuma's cacao storehouse and took a lot of cacao from there, because by 1519 the Spaniards had figured out this was valuable. So this is a chocolate recipe. I'm going to show you 4 recipes that were brought over to Europe. This was brought by Cortez. Okay, so it involves cocoa, white sugar, cinnamon, a Mexican pepper, cloves, vanilla pods, aniseed, hazelnut, and orange flavored water. So these, all of these, the cinnamon comes from, does anyone know where cinnamon originated? Sri Lanka. Ceylon. So remember, the other thing I didn't put up, but the Spanish and the Portuguese, by this point, they're like spread out, not only in the Americas, but they're spread out going east as well. So vanilla, does anyone know where vanilla originates? Also in Mesoamerica. Peppers, so these are chili peppers, and sugar also. Sugar is already in Europe in the 1300s, 1400s, but it's very sort of rare. And of course, the sugar economy, plantation economy, based on slave labor, gets developed almost simultaneously with the cacao plantation. So this is a guy, Antonio de Ledesma, who wrote a book about how sort of chocolate got to Europe. He calls it Chocolata India. And this is actually a picture from the book of Poseidon taking chocolate from Mexico to Europe. So this is his recipe. This is a Spanish recipe in 1644. Cacao beans, chilies, anise. It's very similar to Cortez's recipe. So it makes its way, of course, the cacao makes its way into the courts of, Spain, the elites of Spain, royalty. It was, for example, served by Charles II at an auto de fe in 1680 that was a mass execution of Jews by the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, this is the same Inquisition that is also punishing a lot of indigenous people in Latin America, but it was sort of served to the elites in Madrid during this event. This is Redi of Tuscany, was a duke who also developed, there was a Cosimo, he was a Duke of Tuscany, and there was a very famous recipe for jasmine chocolate that was associated with his court, and there still is today a festival of jasmine chocolate in Tuscany. The recipe was actually brought by Francisco Redi, who was a scientist, very important in parasitology. This is his recipe in Italian. This is the recipe in English, with jasmine, with white sugar, vanilla. Again, you can see quite a number of the same elements. And chocolate made its way into France probably through the Catholic Church, through monks, and there's sometimes multiple paths for how chocolate makes its way to Europe. But one that's very well known is the marriage of the Infanta María Teresa de España at age 14 to Louis XIV. And she popularizes in his court, and for generations after that, chocolate. And this is a recipe from Saint-Vizier, which again, he published 3 for excellent, very good, and good. So I thought, go with the excellent recipe. Cacao, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon. And so I'm going to come back. I'm going to end up, so that recipe that we see for hot chocolate is very similar to the contemporary indigenous recipe for chocolate, which is basically a lot of cacao, a lot of sugar, and cinnamon. I have worked for about 30 years in a number of Zapotec indigenous communities in Oaxaca. And chocolate is consumed, again, on many important occasions, not just that, hey, welcome new day, help you wake up, but also baptisms, weddings, funerals, celebrations of patron saints. It's a very, very important beverage. It's also put out, offered to the dead on Dia de los Muertos, where people put bread and chocolate, literal chocolate and hot chocolate, out because their relatives come back to share the day with them, and they need to be fed. So I think I have about maybe 12, 13 minutes left. So what I wanted to do now was to show you some footage from last summer, just sort of giving you a sense of, in a contemporary sense, what is the process that goes into making chocolate. So this is, I'm just going to show you maybe a minute of each clip. But it begins, these cacao beans, this is in Teotitlan del Valle in Oaxaca. The cacao beans come from Tuxtla Gutierrez, which is south in the state of Chiapas. And they actually come from the coastal region, the Soconusco region. So these are in the marketplace in this indigenous community of Teotitlan. So I'm standing there with Petra, who's about 83, who I've known a long time. And she is making a purchase from this merchant woman who she buys stuff, she's been buying from this woman for, I don't know, 40 years. These are raw beans. Okay? So, she's weighing them. And I'm saying, how much does a kilo cost? 70 pesos, which would be about, let's see, there's 18 to the dollar. She's recognizing me. So I'm asking her where the cacao beans are from. Oh, I'm sorry, Tapachula. So Tapachula, I'm sorry, I said the wrong town. Tapachula is actually on the coast, on the border of Oaxaca and Chiapas.
So she recognized you.
Yes, I lived in this community for 2 years, from 1984 to 1986, and then I've gone back every year. So yeah, she did. But we both look a lot different than we did.
Yeah. You said, yeah.
Okay, this is Petra. Let's see. This one. Okay, so this is just to show you, it's sort of out of order, but how she is using the molinillo, the beater, in a clay pot. This is a pot specifically made for chocolate. So how she sort of is preparing this and raising the foam. And then we'll go back.
Would this be hot?
Yeah, hot water made with water. Yeah. And it's called cakes that we'll see at the end. Because I'm going to go back to like how does that get produced, and then she pours it. And it's got foam. And then it's ready to go. Bread.
Let's meet with water
Water and a cake of chocolate that I'll show you at the
and sugar.
yeah. The next thing I'm going to do is pull up her telling us what the recipe is.
Are those beans inside of that sort of squashy looking thing?
No, I'm gonna, if you'll bear with me,
Okay.
I'm
Alright,
going
so-
to show you, all right. Okay, the recipe basically is like 11, I mean, it's got an unbelievable amount of sugar. Okay.
Entonces la receta otra vez.
Okay, the recipe,
4 kilos de cacao,
4 kilos of cacao,
11 kilos de azúcar,
11 kilos of sugar, 11,
y luego
and then
cuarto de canela,
4
Cuarto kilo.
kilos,
cuarto,
4 quarters, in other words, a kilo of cinnamon.
cuarto.
Mix it together.
Algo.
Okay, so that's the recipe, heavy on the sugar. So that's, I mean, that is not a pre-Hispanic recipe, right? That's the recipe with sugar added. And in fact, most of the recipes before the Spaniards are there are cacao mixed sometimes with chile, sometimes with honey, or with other kinds of sweeteners, but no sugar, because there is not sugar. And the word chocolate itself actually originates just outside Antigua, Guatemala, very early
in the colonial period, about maybe 1531. So it's actually not an indigenous word. It's a word that, chocolate, that is created at that point in time, probably with indigenous people, but it is not, there's a lot of sort of myths that it's a Nahua word, word that comes from the language of the Aztec. Okay, so this is toasting the beans. This is called a comal. It's a clay griddle, which is also produced right there, not in this community, but in another community by hand. So the cacao beans have to be toasted. In any chocolate making process, whether it's commercial or the sort of handcrafted, the beans have to be, they have to be toasted. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of footage of toasting them on the comal and sort of stirring them around. So all 4 kilos have to be toasted in this way. And you have to keep moving them so they don't burn. So the next thing you have to do is peel the skin off. And that's the most labor-intensive part. It took 4 of us, I think, about 2.5 or 3 hours to peel the 4 kilos of cacao. And my now 16-year-old son was great. He really pitched in. So this is Petra doing some peeling. So you have to break it's a dry sort of skin that you have to break off, and what it leaves inside is what's called it's the bean, or the nib. You may have seen them, they sell them now, like in Market of Choice, you can buy raw cocoa nibs. And it's like a big thing in European nightclubs now too, to sort of fuel dancing. So taking the skin off. There's another, you can see that they're kind of toasted. They toast them, and they have machines that sort of grate them. And then, I mean, there's several mechanical inventions that facilitated commercial chocolate.
Lynn, do you have a sense for how many servings of chocolate that 4 kilos is going to provide?
I don't really. I can take a guess at the end when we look at it, but a lot.
So you're doing this every week?
No, they're doing this. I mean, she's doing it, and she may sell some of it, but it'll provision the family for, a couple months. So this is the cinnamon that's going to be kind of mixed in. That's the other ingredient. Yeah, this is the raw cacao, the toasted cacao with the cinnamon. And what's going to happen is it could be hand ground on a metate, but Petra's 83, so we're going to the corn mill. We're going to the molino, and there is where we add the 11 kilos of sugar, and it gets sort of ground, and so that'll be our next step. So we take the cacao with the canela, and then we actually take a moto taxi, this is a 3-wheel taxi, and we go to the molino, where it gets mixed in the same place where women bring their corn, and they're limed and grown into masa. But side business is chocolate grinding. Obviously, they clean the mill out. So it goes in the grinder. these big tubs, so it's like it's a lot. And then it'll go back in the grinder. It goes through, and then we put it in buckets, and we take it back home. And then Petra grinds it into these cakes. She forms it into like these cakes. So she makes it into kind of this round mound, and then cuts it into these pieces. Maybe a tiny bit, but it's really pretty moist, because there's a lot of, there's no process for removing the butter, cocoa butter. In commercial processing, there's an ionizing process that takes cocoa butter out, and that's how you get powder for making hot chocolate. When you make a chocolate bar, you put some of the cocoa butter back in and grind it and put it through a process called conching. Yeah, so she's going to cut it into these pieces. And then eventually, I'll show you each one of those pieces is the basis for about 1.5 cups of hot chocolate with water. It's one of those pieces that she puts in that pot with the water and kind of whips up. I forgot, I have some in my office. I forgot to bring it to pass around some of the pieces. But so that's essentially the piece, and this is what she'll keep for her family, and that's what will be used to make the chocolate every morning.
So how high is, cocoa butter, what's the fat content of that?
Hi.
It's yummy. So no milk in the recipe.
So this is my final clip. This is Paco, who's helping us the whole time.
This chocolate is very delicious.
Con más vigor.
This chocolate is very delicious. This is special from Oaxaca.
Okay, that's it. So, chocolate in the Americas. I think we have maybe 10, 12 minutes for questions?
Yeah, we have some time for questions. Turn on the lights.
Sure. Yeah, why don't we take a couple? Yeah, here and here.
There's also a fermentation process going on, right?
There is prior to, okay, in this case we started with the beans that have already been sort of dried. But prior to that, yes, when you take the pod down from the tree, you have to cut it open and it ferments like 24, 48 hours. Then you take the seeds out and you dry them on a drying rack in the sun outside.
Is that for flavor, or what's the reason for the fermentation?
I think it's partially flavor, but it's also to just start the drying process, because you have to be able to remove them from the pods easily. And it also does involve the flavor process. You also have to be careful of mold, and there's a lot of things that can kind of go wrong. There's a lot of issues now, actually, for cacao farmers in West Africa, everywhere, actually. So yes, you're correct. Yeah.
My question is more, how much did chocolate, cacao, influence trade in Europe, and how hot a commodity was it? How did it impact cultural change? Like, you have the kings and queens of Spain
Right.
and France.
Well, the price was very, very high. Originally it was just like spices. Sugar, for example, started out in the 1300s. It was literally worth its weight in gold. It came from the Middle East, and it was used as a spice. It was used extremely sparingly. And, sort of the same thing with chocolate. It was a very sort of elite commodity.
And it was commercialized in plantations in the Caribbean and actually in Brazil in a big way. And it involved, I mean, the whole plantation production system. It was very much involved in what's called the triangular trade system, which involved the production of sugar and cacao by slaves, enslaved Africans. In Latin America, I mean, there were 4 million people brought as slaves from Africa to Latin America. Many, many, many more than to the U.S. Many more. I think there was about 250, 300,000. I mean, the numbers are much, much lower in the U.S. So there's actually huge Afro-descendant populations, very, very significant, all over Latin America, including Mexico, including Chile, including Argentina, and they've been very invisible. Some people even took the category of Afro-descendant out of their censuses in the 1800s and 1900s in an attempt to sort of whiten and improve their national, sort of image. There's a whole history of anti-Black racism in Latin America, just like there is in this country. Can I just finish her question? So, and originally in Brazil, they tried to enslave indigenous people, and they just didn't work out on plantations. They died of diseases, of course, and fled. So the system and sugar worked on exactly the same system in the Caribbean, in many parts of Latin America, in a plantation system. So both cacao and sugar were part of a sort of slave export production nexus that brought enslaved peoples over. And if you look at Brazil, the distance between Angola and Brazil, West Africa and Brazil, it's not that far. So, and then also later, the islands of Sao Tome and Principe, which are which were major slave depots, became major cacao plantations, primarily for Cadbury's and British colonialism and French colonialism, and Spanish and English colonialism are part of this story. So, bringing enslaved Africans, sending cacao and sugar back to Europe, and also rum. So it's very much a part of that triangular trade. Cacao becomes slowly, it becomes commercialized, and really it's a number of things that happen that allow that to happen. One is mechanization, so that like industrial steam-driven grinders, because literally until even in Italy, like in 1840, 1850, and in France, there were people who would come to your door with essentially what is a metate, a grinding stone and a grinder, and they would grind your chocolate. It was like a profession. And as soon as, industrialization gets underway in Europe, there's a grinder. There's also a Swiss guy who invents a process for extracting the cocoa butter, the fat out of the beans, so it's just the powder, and it can be remixed with milk. We have Nestle, who invents, baby formula and powdered milk. And another Swiss person, who invents a sort of conching process. It's these rollers that sort of process the chocolate, and it's turned into what's called liqueur, and then it's molded, and it's, molded in these different forms. So the industrialization makes it much cheaper. The price goes down, people start to consume it, and actually in Europe, the whole industrial revolution begins to change the way that people eat, how they process food. They're not getting food out of their own gardens. In England, tea becomes the major drink, and sugar. So you actually watch the production of confections that involve chocolate that go with tea and coffee, and really becomes sort of the diet of the working class. And it's a bad substitution in terms of the calories are there, but the protein isn't there, and sort of the diversity of the diet. And then actually militaries have been very important in commercializing chocolate too. In World War I and all over in Europe, the British Navy, had Cadbury's, and the Army in World War I. The U.S. Government gave contracts to World War I, but World War II, big contracts to Hershey's more than anything else. Hershey's and Coca-Cola were official products of the U.S. military in World War II. They were exempt from sugar rationing in World War II. And actually, Hershey set up, there was a whole Hersheyville, Cuba. Hershey was having trouble getting his sugar during World War I, so he decided to open a railroad, a plantation, and a whole sugar operation in Cuba to be able to provision himself. After, and he let it go, I think, I can't remember, in the 40s, in the 50s, 1959, with the Cuban Revolution, that was cut, but the railroad still runs in Cuba 3 times a day. So, I mean, there's a lot of elements involved in the commercialization. Any other questions, comments, recommendations for chocolate?
I have a question. I was in Honduras recently, and there's some movement to revive the production of cacao there. Right. And I was wondering if that's also true in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, there is sort of small-scale cacao production. I mean, I run the whole Soconusco region and the regions in Honduras and other places where cacao is, I guess we could call it native. It's not wild there, but have been deforested in many ways. There's other kinds of crops. The Soconusco is other kinds of crops now, but there is a movement, to sort of replant in some places. And there are sort of artisanal chocolate production, small-scale factories. I was in Guatemala, and I'm doing research there again this summer. There's a chocolate museum in Antigua, and I went to a cacao plantation there outside of Antigua, and a small, sort of really like garage size, production of chocolate. I'm going to tour another facility in Shela. They're geared towards tourists. They're geared towards the fair trade sort of movement. And I mean, there's also a lot of deception that goes on with sort of organic fair trade production, because, I mean, most of the cacao comes from 2 countries, from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Ghana has a cocoa board that actually guarantees a price for producers, and it's actually been above the fair trade price recently. And in Cote d'Ivoire, it's just an open cash market. And today, most cocoa farming is done on family farms of 3 acres in very, complex situations. Cote d'Ivoire had a war for a long time. And family farming involves children. I mean, it's like not just for cacao, but there's been some trafficking in children. There's been kids working in unsafe conditions. But I'll have to say, as someone who's done work on farm work in Oregon, there also, until not that long ago, have been kids working on farms in Oregon, also in not optimal conditions. So it's not like, labor exploitation is only happening in West Africa. It's happening, it's happening here as well. So I think it's interesting when there are these sort of artisanal projects. There are many, many companies, including Nestle, Hershey, Cadbury's, who now say they're producing fair trade chocolate, and they're building cooperatives and healthcare. And, if you buy this as a consumer, then you are helping the cocoa farmer. And it's actually very hard to substantiate those kinds of claims. There are a few instances that are well documented, but there's a lot of people, a lot of companies sort of riding on the marketing of organic, the marketing of fair trade, et cetera. And there also are some sensationalistic accounts of child slave labor. And there are some trafficked children, but there are many children who are going to school, and they are working some of the day on a cocoa farm or on another kind of farm. And, so it's a complicated picture. And I don't know what the situation is in Honduras, but anything that will help Honduras is good. I mean, we have a coup, the highest murder rate in the continent, sometimes in the world, and we also have a policy here of deporting Central Americans who come. We don't necessarily grant them the right to counsel. And we have a lot of Central Americans who have recently come who are right here in Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County, including children from Guatemala and from Honduras and a few from El Salvador, but in the state. So we have a connection with those children and, with cacao. So good question. Yeah, Barbara.
Well, this is a formal question.
I'm happy to stay, another 5 or 10 minutes. So if it's over at 1 and you need to go, do we need to vacate the room or?
So now I'm super afraid to write how do I, what do I learn?
Well, I don't want to stop you from eating chocolate. I couldn't stop eating chocolate. I'm just trying to say that there are a lot of complexities in producing chocolate, and one needs to be aware. I mean, I think for example, for cacao that comes from Ghana, Ghana has issues, but at least there's a guaranteed price. The price is high, and the government. I mean, Ghana actually resisted sort of pressure from, shall we say, the World Bank sort of neoliberal pressures, global lending pressures that say, we want you to put everything on the free market. And they said no, because we want to get, anything that's a guaranteed price that is not free market, it's not free trade, okay? But the Ghana government is guaranteeing a price for cocoa farmers that people can count on. So, I mean, that's something positive. So I don't know, you can look for the sourcing of your cacao, but you can't really know because most commercial chocolate and even alternative chocolate, for example, I know I had, like I said, Van, one of the owners of Euphoria Chocolate, he and his wife Bonnie, they've owned it for about 2 years. They actually lived in Costa Rica for a long time before they moved here. So they know a little bit about the economy of Central America. They weren't experts in chocolate, but they buy from a broker who's in Eugene, and he buys his cacao from like 25 countries. And even the bars that they have, that they do bean to bar, where they buy the beans, they do the whole process there, which is highly unusual and which Euphoria didn't used to do. It's a new process for them to buy the beans and then process it. So, I mean, they experiment. He mixes beans from Ecuador and Ghana, and and if you go to this guy's website, I joked with my students, it's like wine, and now it's like marijuana in Eugene. No, really, you've got 25 kinds, different colors, different flavors, different aftertaste. So the whole chocolate industry now is, I mean, it's commercial, but it's also, I think the next thing that'll be artisanal in Eugene after beer might be chocolate. I mean, it's already happening. So people are sourcing these from, these buyers who, then buy from other people, traders who speculate on the international cocoa market, and they pull, they just pull things from everywhere. So it's very, very hard to know. I think if you did, I know that the chocolate's sitting in my office. I mean, I know where it was processed, but I don't know, what was the condition for these beans cocoa beans from Tapachula. They were probably, Guatemalan refugees who worked in the cocoa harvest that's been going on for a really long time under really bad conditions, So but it's not just chocolate. I mean, if we were to do this, look at your clothes. What are you wearing? What kind of coffee did you drink this morning? Everything. And I mean, the thing about chocolate is people love it, and they can kind of listen to this message about labor and where it came from. And but it's not just the chocolate, it's everything that we consume, and our clothing, and my iPhone here, which 13-year-old girl worked on putting the pieces together that went into the phone, and wherever, my shoes, unless you make it all yourself, we really don't know. But I think there may be some good and better, worse, choices. I think supporting local businesses like Euphoria or other kinds of businesses like that, they have, they pay their employees well. research at least your local business so you can know that part of it. And, it's very hard to know all of it, but good question. Yeah, thank you all for coming.